Today is April 16th, Easter Thursday, or Thursday in the octave of Easter. The first 8 days of Easter, like other major feasts in the Catholic Church, are considered the octave. They're a continuation of that celebration. So we're still in Easter. In fact, in some sense, we can say it's still Easter Day. The gospel for today's Mass is a continuation of yesterday's gospel from Luke, the story of the two disciples walking to Emmaus, Clopas and an unnamed disciple. And as they're walking to Emmaus, which is probably their home, they're leaving Jerusalem, Jesus comes and starts walking alongside them, but they're prevented from recognizing him. And he says, "Oh, what are you talking about as you go along?" And they say, "Oh, about the things that happened this week in Jerusalem." "What things?" I love that because he's just messing with them. But they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who does not know of these things? How Jesus of Nazareth, powerful in word and deed and worked miracles, and then was arrested and tortured and put to death. And now they're saying he rose from the dead. And then Jesus says, "How slow you are to believe," and then explains to them all the Old Testament prophecies that foretold that he would suffer and die on the cross and then on the third day rise. And their hearts are burning within them as they hear these accounts or this explanation. Then when they get to Emmaus, Jesus pretends like he's going further down the road. But they say, "Oh, no, it's late. You should stay with us." And so okay. And then they recognize him when? In the breaking of the bread. Breaking of the bread, yes, it could be a basic meal, but it's also symbolic language of the Eucharist, as we recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread when we celebrate the Mass. The bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. So they're so excited because Jesus immediately disappears from their sight. They acknowledge that their hearts were burning in them as they were listening to him, and they run all the way back to Jerusalem, 7 miles. And this is at night, so it's harder to get around. Plus, you risk being robbed. There are thieves along the road. So it's not a safe time to travel, but they're so enthused they get back there. That's where the gospel picks up for today, a continuation of Luke's gospel, chapter 24. The disciples of Jesus then recounted what had taken place along the way, the road to Emmaus, and how they had come to recognize him in the breaking of the bread. While they were still speaking about this, Jesus stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." Were they suddenly filled with peace? No. What was their reaction? They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. That word terrified, the word that's used there, is the kind of terror that is experienced at wartime. It's the same terror, the word terror, in the Greek-speaking Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures that Luke would have been quoting from. It's the word that's used at Sinai in the book of Exodus when there's a great theophany and God is made manifest through loud trumpets and shaking of the earth, and the Israelites are terrified. That's the same word. So they're not feeling peaceful. They don't know what's going on. They think he's a ghost, and then he tries to convince them, "I'm not a ghost. I am flesh and blood," and shows him his hands and feet. And then he asks for something to eat because everybody knows ghosts can't eat. And they give him some dried fish, and he eats it in front of them. And they start to calm down. And then he, like he did on the road to Emmaus, tells how all the prophecies foretold who he would be and what his role would be. Helps them to understand what this all means and put it together. It's God's logic, God's wisdom, God's insight. And then he says, because this is your mission, I am going to send you out as witnesses. That's their mission as apostles, to be sent. That's what apostle means. They're going to be sent on mission. And they're going to risk their lives. They're all, except for John, going to suffer martyrdom. So they need to be convinced. He wants to convince them this is truly how it is. So now when people kind of water down the gospel message and say, "Well, I don't know, did he rise from the dead, or was it just a really rich experience that made it seem as if he was risen from the dead?" Or those different heresy statements from ancient times, but still today people do that. They say, well, maybe he was just another human being, a great prophet like Muhammad or Buddha. I know when people do that, it drives me crazy because they're not the same. You can't compare those. It's like saying, well, water and coffee and whiskey, they're all basically the same, right? They're liquids. Well, no, they're very different. You wouldn't give whiskey to a baby. So there's a distancing from the truth when people make those kind of statements. But Jesus is saying, no, I am flesh and blood. I am God, and I'm truly risen from the real death, And he wants them to know that and be convinced of that. And in that conviction, they will proclaim the fullness of truth. That's what we're called to embrace on this Feast of Easter, this continuation of the Feast of Easter, the fullness of truth, and then proclaim it, at least in our actions, if not also in our words. God bless you.